She pointed to the seat number with the confidence of someone who had never been told no, until the flight attendant whispered 6 words that shattered everything she thought she knew. "Ma'am, he owns the entire airline." Welcome back, my beautiful family and friends. If you're hooked in and you're ready to enjoy this story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it. Now let us begin. But that revelation was still 2 hours away. Right now, Rebecca Chen Williams was exactly where she belonged, or so she told herself as she strode through the glass corridors of Patterson and Associates, her heels clicking a familiar rhythm of success against the polished marble floors. "Rebecca, the Morrison account is asking for revisions again," her assistant called out, jogging to keep pace with her determined stride. "Of course they are." Rebecca didn't slow down, her manicured fingers already pulling up emails on her phone. "Schedule the call for Thursday, and make sure they know our consultation fee for excessive revisions." She paused at her corner office door, taking in the view of downtown Seattle that had once made her heart race with pride. Now it felt like a beautiful cage. The divorce papers were finally signed, the house was sold, and her ex-husband had moved to Portland with his yoga instructor. At 34, Rebecca Chen Williams was supposedly living her dream life: senior marketing director, 6-figure salary, her name on the building directory. So why did she feel like she was suffocating? "Your flight to Denver leaves in 3 hours, her assistant reminded her. "The car will be here in 20 minutes. Rebecca nodded, adjusting the lapels of her tailored blazer. The Morrison account could make or break her shot at the partnership. She'd worked for this moment for 8 years, climbing every rung with precision and determination. She deserved that first-class seat, deserved the recognition, deserved to finally prove she belonged at the top. Her phone buzzed with a text from her mother. "Hope the presentation goes well, honey. Maybe this success will help you find a nice man who appreciates ambition." Rebecca deleted the message without responding. Everyone had opinions about her life, her choices, her worth. Well, after Thursday, none of that would matter. She'd have the partnership, the respect and the security that came with being indispensable. 3,000 miles away, Jonathan Rivers sat behind a mahogany desk that cost more than most people's cars, staring at passenger satisfaction reports that made his jaw clench. Skybridge Airlines had been his dream, built from nothing after he'd earned his first billion in tech. But dreams, he'd learned, were fragile things. The Denver to Seattle route continues to show concerning feedback, his operations manager Patricia said from across the desk. Passenger complaints about service quality are up 15% this quarter. Jonathan rubbed his temples, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. At 36, he'd achieved everything society said should make him happy. The Forbes list, the sprawling mansion, the private jets, but happiness, it seemed, wasn't something you could buy, no matter how much money you threw at it. "I'll handle the inspection personally," he said, closing the report. "Book me on the next flight to Seattle, coach." Patricia's eyebrows shot up. "Sir, you have a private coach," Jonathan repeated firmly. "How else am I supposed to see what our customers actually experience?" His phone rang. His mother, like clockwork. "Jonathan, baby, when are you coming home for Sunday dinner? And please tell me you're bringing someone special this time." He smiled despite himself. Evelyn Rivers was the only person on earth who could make a billionaire feel like a disappointed teenager. "Just me, Mom. As usual." "That's not natural, honey. A successful, handsome man like you should have women lining up." "They do," he thought bitterly. For all the wrong reasons. Every woman he'd dated had been more interested in his net worth than his heart. The last one had actually asked about prenups on their second date. After that, he'd stopped trying. It was easier to focus on work, on building something meaningful, than to keep hoping someone might see Jonathan the person instead of Jonathan the bank account. "I have to go, Mom. Business trip." "You work too much." Success means nothing if you have no one to share it with. The irony wasn't lost on him. He owned airlines, hotels, tech companies, an empire built on connecting people, yet he'd never felt more alone. An hour later, Jonathan stood in the Denver airport, wearing jeans and a simple button-down shirt, his baseball cap pulled low. No one recognized him. No one stared or whispered, or suddenly became overly friendly. For a few precious hours, he could just be a regular passenger, invisible and free. He checked his boarding pass, seat 3A first class, but he'd specifically requested it to observe the service standards his premium customers received. The irony made him chuckle. He owned the airline, but he'd bought a ticket like everyone else. As he walked toward the gate, Jonathan noticed a woman in an expensive suit arguing with an airline employee about carry-on restrictions. Her voice carried that particular tone of someone used to getting her way, backed by the assumption that rules were suggestions for people like her. Something about her reminded him of every entitled passenger complaint he'd read that morning. She was exactly the type of customer who made his job harder, people who believed their boarding pass came with special privileges and extra patience from the staff. He had no idea that in less than an hour, that same woman would be standing beside his seat, demanding he move. What moments in your life have challenged everything you thought you knew about yourself? Share in the comments. I'd love to hear your stories of unexpected discoveries. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal, calling first-class passengers to board. Both Rebecca and Jonathan gathered their belongings, neither aware they were about to collide in the most uncomfortable and life-changing way possible. Rebecca's heels clicked confidently down the jet bridge, her leather carry-on rolling smoothly behind her. First class was her sanctuary, a place where everything made sense, where she belonged without question. The familiar scent of leather seats and that subtle airline cologne always signaled the same thing: she had arrived. Seat 3A. Window seat. Extra legroom, perfect for working on her presentation during the 3-hour flight to Seattle. She'd specifically requested it when booking, had paid the upgrade fee without blinking. This was her space, her time, her moment to prepare for the most important presentation of her career. But as she rounded the corner into the first-class cabin, her confident stride faltered. Someone was already in her seat. A black man in his mid-30s sat quietly by the window, his attention focused on a thick manila folder spread across his tray table. He wore simple jeans and a navy button-down shirt, not the usual first-class attire she was accustomed to seeing. His baseball cap was pulled low, and he seemed completely absorbed in whatever he was reading. Rebecca checked her boarding pass again. Seat 3A. No mistake. She cleared her throat politely. "Excuse me." He looked up, and she found herself momentarily caught by his dark eyes, intelligent, patient, but guarded. There was something unsettling about his calm demeanor, as if he was used to being questioned, used to having to justify his presence in spaces like this. "I think there might be some confusion," Rebecca continued, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone accustomed to resolving problems efficiently. "This is my seat, 3A. Jonathan glanced at his own boarding pass, then back at her. "I have 3A as well," he said quietly, holding up his ticket. Rebecca's smile tightened. She'd dealt with booking errors before, and they were always easily resolved, usually in her favor. "Well, I made this reservation 3 weeks ago, and paid for the upgrade. I'm sure we can sort this out with the flight attendant." But even as she said it, something in his expression shifted. A familiar resignation crossed his features, so brief she almost missed it, as if he'd been through this exact scenario before. "Of course," he said, starting to gather his papers. "I'll just move." "No need to move anywhere just yet," Rebecca interrupted, raising her hand with the practiced authority of someone who managed people for a living. "Let's get this straightened out properly." She flagged down the nearest flight attendant, a petite woman with kind eyes and an apologetic smile already forming. The name tag read Jennifer. "Hi, I'm Rebecca Chen Williams, and there seems to be a seating mix-up. We both have boarding passes for 3A." Rebecca handed over her documents with the confident expectation of swift resolution. Jennifer examined both boarding passes, her brow furrowing slightly. Other first-class passengers had begun to take notice, conversations pausing as the minor drama unfolded. Rebecca felt their attention like a spotlight, and something about being watched while disputing a seat with this particular man made her uncomfortable in ways she couldn't quite name. "I'm so sorry for the confusion," Jennifer said, looking between them. "Mr. Rivers," Jonathan supplied quietly. "Mr. Rivers, it looks like there was indeed a booking error on our end. I can offer you seat 4B, which is also a window seat, or I can upgrade you to our premium economy cabin and provide a voucher for future travel." Rebecca felt a small surge of vindication. Of course there had been an error, these things happened, and they were always resolved reasonably. She began moving toward the seat, already mentally shifting back into presentation prep mode. But Jonathan didn't move. "Actually," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge she hadn't heard before, "I'd like to keep this seat. I specifically booked 3A for a reason." Rebecca turned, surprised by the pushback. "I understand, but as Jennifer said, there are other options available, and I did book this seat weeks ago. I have a crucial client presentation to prepare for, and I really need the window seat to work without distractions. And I have crucial business to attend to as well." Something in his tone made her bristle. Was he challenging her? The assumption that his business was somehow more important than hers struck her as presumptuous. She'd worked too hard and come too far to be displaced by someone who probably got his first-class seat through some kind of employee discount or last-minute upgrade. "Look," she said, her professional smile becoming more strained, "I'm sure you understand that sometimes these mix-ups happen. Jennifer has offered you perfectly good alternatives, and it would really help me out if you could just—" "Ma'am." Jennifer's voice cut through the tension, and something about her expression made both Rebecca and Jonathan turn toward her. The flight attendant looked uncomfortable, almost pained, as if she was about to deliver news that would change everything. "Ma'am, I've just received word from our operations team." Jennifer's voice dropped to barely above a whisper, but somehow it seemed to fill the entire first-class cabin. "Mr. Rivers, he owns the entire airline." The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. The world seemed to tilt, her vision narrowing to focus on Jonathan's face, as the implication crashed over her in waves. The calm resignation in his eyes, the way he'd been prepared to move without argument, the manila folder on his tray table, she could now see it was filled with what looked like operational reports and passenger complaint summaries. Around them, the first-class cabin had gone completely silent. Other passengers stared with the fascination of people witnessing a spectacular accident. Rebecca felt heat creep up her neck as the magnitude of her assumptions became crystal clear. She'd just tried to strong-arm the owner of the airline out of his own seat. Jonathan closed the folder slowly, his movements deliberate and measured. When he looked at her again, something fundamental had shifted in his expression. The patience was still there, but now it was layered with something deeper, disappointment, maybe, or perhaps just the familiar sting of confirmation that people always revealed who they really were, given enough time. "I think," he said quietly, "seat 4B will work just fine for me after all." But Rebecca barely heard him. She was drowning in the realization of what had just happened, what she had just revealed about herself in front of a plane full of witnesses. Her professional composure cracked as she stood frozen in the aisle, boarding pass trembling in her hand, finally understanding that sometimes the seats we fight for aren't worth the cost of claiming them. Rebecca's hands shook as she fumbled with her seatbelt in 3A, the seat that now felt more like a throne built on shame than the sanctuary she'd imagined. Jonathan had quietly moved to 4B, just one row behind her, but she could feel his presence like a weight against her shoulders. Every whisper from other passengers felt like an accusation, every sideways glance a judgment she richly deserved. "He owns the entire airline." The words echoed in her mind as she stared blindly at her laptop screen, the Morrison presentation seeming trivial now compared to the crater she'd just blown in her own character. But Rebecca Chen Williams hadn't clawed her way to the top by accepting defeat gracefully. No, she'd built her career on damage control, on spinning disasters into opportunities, on never letting them see you sweat. This was just another problem to solve. She pulled out her phone and began typing furiously. Had an awkward encounter on the flight. Booking mix-up led to misunderstanding with another passenger. You know how these things go, airline errors happen all the time. We'll be ready to give 100% to the presentation tomorrow. She read it 3 times before deleting every word. Even to herself, it sounded hollow. Her mind raced through rationalization after rationalization. She'd been polite, professional. Anyone would have made the same assumption about seating priority. First come, first served was basic airline etiquette. How was she supposed to know he owned the company? He wasn't wearing a suit, wasn't carrying himself like an executive, wasn't displaying any of the typical markers of success she'd learned to recognize. The thought stopped her cold. Markers of success. What exactly had she been looking for? What assumptions had she made based on what? "Can I get you anything to drink?" Jennifer appeared at her elbow, her smile professional but strained. Even the flight attendant seemed uncomfortable around her now. "White wine," Rebecca said automatically, then caught herself. "Please, thank you." As Jennifer moved away, Rebecca risked a glance backward. Jonathan sat with his folder open again, reading with the same quiet concentration as before. From her new angle, she could see more of the documents: passenger satisfaction surveys, operational reports, what looked like employee feedback forms. He was actually working, not just trying to look important. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Morrison execs confirmed for 9 a.m. tomorrow. Conference room is booked. You've got this. You've got this." The phrase that used to pump her full of confidence now felt like mockery. What did she have? Exactly. A career built on aggressive competence, and the assumption that she belonged in every room she entered. A divorce that happened because she'd never learned when to back down from a fight. A track record of getting what she wanted by leveraging other people's reluctance to cause a scene. She opened her laptop and tried to focus on her presentation slides, but the words blurred together. Every bullet point about consumer confidence and brand positioning felt like a joke. How could she talk about understanding markets and demographics when she'd just proven she understood nothing about the people right in front of her? Behind her, she heard Jonathan's phone ring softly. "Hi, Mom." His voice was quiet, but in the confined space, she couldn't help but overhear. "Yeah, I'm on the plane now." "No, the same as always." "Mom, we've talked about this." There was something painfully familiar about the conversation, the gentle exasperation, the love mixed with exhaustion. It reminded her of her own mother's calls, the constant questions about her personal life, the worry disguised as advice. "I'm not being too picky," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping even lower. "It's just complicated. No, I can't just put myself out there like you think. You don't understand what it's like when people only see." He trailed off, and Rebecca felt a stab of guilt for eavesdropping. But she couldn't help herself. This was the man she'd just dismissed, the human being she'd reduced to an inconvenience in her perfectly planned day. "I have to go, Mom. I love you too." The silence that followed felt heavier than the engine noise around them. Rebecca stared at her laptop screen, seeing nothing, understanding for the first time that her humiliation might be the least important thing happening in this moment. She'd spent the last 20 minutes trying to rebuild her self-image, to find ways to minimize what had happened, to cast herself as the victim of an unfortunate misunderstanding. But Jonathan wasn't trying to rebuild anything. He'd simply accepted what had happened with the resignation of someone who'd been through it before. How many times before? The question hit her like ice water. How many times had he been questioned, dismissed, treated like he didn't belong in the spaces he'd earned the right to occupy? How many times had people looked at him and made the same assumptions she'd just made? Her wine arrived, and she took a large gulp, hoping it would wash away the bitter taste of recognition. She'd always considered herself progressive, enlightened, someone who judged people by their actions rather than their appearance. She'd worked with diverse teams, promoted inclusivity in her campaigns, donated to the right causes. But when it came down to a moment of actual interaction, a real test of her values, she'd failed spectacularly. She pulled out her phone again, this time opening a new text to Jonathan's number, which she realized with another wave of mortification that she didn't have and couldn't get without asking the flight attendant, which would only draw more attention to her mistake. Instead, she opened her notes app and began typing. "I am so sorry. I made assumptions that were wrong and hurtful. I acted entitled and dismissive. I have no excuse except that I wasn't paying attention to anything but my own needs, and I'm embarrassed by what that says about who I am." She stared at the words for a long moment, then deleted them. What was the point? He'd already seen exactly who she was. No amount of apologizing could undo that moment in the aisle, the way she'd spoken to him, the assumptions she'd broadcast to an entire cabin of witnesses. The plane hit a patch of turbulence, and Rebecca gripped her armrest, watching the city lights below blur into streaks of gold. Somewhere behind her, Jonathan Rivers, billionaire, airline owner, someone's son who called his mother and worried about being understood, was probably thinking about how right he'd been to stop trying to connect with people. And she was the reason why. How do you apologize for revealing something ugly about yourself that you didn't even know was there? Have you ever had to confront the gap between who you thought you were and who you actually are? I'm curious to hear your thoughts in the comments. The turbulence worsened, and the captain's voice crackled over the intercom with words that would change everything. "Ladies and gentlemen, due to severe weather conditions in Seattle, we'll be making an emergency landing in Spokane. All passengers will need to remain in the terminal overnight while we wait for conditions to clear." Rebecca closed her eyes, already knowing that her carefully planned presentation prep time had just evaporated. But for the first time since boarding, that wasn't the thing she was most worried about. Spokane's airport at 11 p.m. looked like a ghost town wrapped in fluorescent lighting. The emergency landing had deposited 200 irritated passengers into a terminal that clearly wasn't prepared for an overnight invasion. Delayed flight announcements echoed through empty corridors while travelers claimed territories around charging stations and vending machines, resigned to an uncomfortable night on airport furniture. Rebecca stood near the gate, her phone pressed to her ear, watching airline employees distribute blankets and apologetic smiles in equal measure. "No, Mr. Morrison, I understand this is inconvenient, but the weather is completely out of our control. Yes, I can present via video call if necessary, but I really think the in-person impact would be, I see, tomorrow afternoon then." She hung up and stared at her phone screen, watching her carefully orchestrated timeline crumble. The Morrison presentation, her shot at partnership, pushed back 24 hours because of circumstances beyond anyone's control. The irony wasn't lost on her that she was stranded overnight by the very airline whose owner she'd just humiliated. "Excuse me, ma'am?" A harried airline employee approached with a clipboard. "I'm distributing hotel vouchers for passengers willing to share rooms. We've managed to secure a block at the Holiday Inn, but availability is extremely limited." Rebecca looked around the terminal. Families with small children were already spreading out makeshift beds near the windows. Business travelers hunched over laptops, trying to salvage their own disrupted plans. The prospect of a real bed, even a shared one, felt like salvation. "Yes, absolutely. I'll take it." "Great, you'll be sharing with the employee consulted his list. "Mr. Rivers." The name hit her like a slap. Rebecca looked across the terminal and spotted Jonathan sitting alone in a corner, still working through his manila folder despite the chaos around him. Even from this distance, she could see the exhaustion in his shoulders, the way he'd removed his baseball cap to run his hands through his hair. Actually, she started, maybe I could. I'm sorry, but those are the only rooms left. It's this arrangement or the terminal floor. The employee was already walking away, moving on to the next stranded passenger. Rebecca stood frozen, voucher in hand, facing a choice that felt impossible. Approach the man she'd wronged and ask to share a hotel room, or spend the night trying to sleep on airport furniture while he got the bed she could have had. The decision was made for her when the terminal lights suddenly dimmed to half power. "Attention passengers," the overhead announcement crackled. "To conserve energy overnight, we'll be operating on minimal lighting. The terminal will remain open, but please be aware that most services will be unavailable until 6 a.m. In the sudden dimness, the terminal took on an entirely different character. Shadows stretched across the floor, turning the space intimate despite its size. The harsh fluorescent judgment of full lighting gave way to something softer, more forgiving. Rebecca found herself walking toward Jonathan's corner before she consciously decided to move. He looked up as she approached, his expression guarded but not hostile. In the dim light, she could see details she'd missed before: the tiredness around his eyes, the quality of his simple clothes that suggested expense despite their casual appearance, the way he held himself like someone perpetually ready for disappointment. "Mr. Rivers," her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "I have a hotel voucher, and apparently we're assigned as roommates for the night." Jonathan closed his folder slowly. "You don't have to do this." "Do what?" "Pretend this isn't awkward. I can find somewhere else to sleep." He gestured toward the terminal around them. "I've slept in worse places." The casual way he said it made Rebecca's chest tighten. Of course he'd slept in worse places. Before he owned Airlines and appeared on Forbes lists, he'd been someone else, someone who'd earned his way up from circumstances she couldn't imagine. "The room has 2 beds," she said quietly. "And honestly, after the day I've had, I don't think I could sleep on these chairs if I tried." Something shifted in his expression, not quite a smile, but a softening around the edges. "Fair enough." The shuttle ride to the hotel passed in silence, broken only by the driver's cheerful commentary about Spokane's attractions and tomorrow's weather forecast. Rebecca stared out the window at empty streets and closed businesses, acutely aware of Jonathan's presence beside her. He smelled like cedar and something she couldn't identify, maybe the particular scent of someone who'd learned to move through the world quietly. The Holiday Inn lobby was a chaos of stranded passengers, but Jonathan approached the desk with the same calm patience he'd shown on the plane. Rebecca watched him interact with the frazzled desk clerk, noticed how he never raised his voice or showed irritation despite the obvious incompetence in front of them. "I'm sorry, sir, but the system is showing you as needing to pay an additional fee for the upgrade to 2 beds. "That's fine," Jonathan said, pulling out his credit card without hesitation. "No," Rebecca stepped forward. "I'll pay the fee. This situation it's my fault we're in this position." Jonathan looked at her steadily. "How is an emergency landing your fault?" The question hung between them as the desk clerk processed payment and handed over key cards. Rebecca knew he was right about the weather, but they both understood she was talking about something deeper: the weight of discomfort, the awkwardness that made sharing space feel like penance instead of simple necessity. Room 314 was exactly what she'd expected from an airport hotel: 2 double beds, a small table, a bathroom barely big enough for 1 person. But after the terminal's harsh lighting and public chaos, it felt like a sanctuary. Jonathan set his folder on the table and moved toward the window, maintaining careful distance. Rebecca claimed the bed nearest the door, a habit from years of business travel that suddenly felt presumptuous. "I should shower," she said, needing something to break the silence that had settled over them like a blanket. "Of course." When she emerged 20 minutes later, hair damp and wearing the hotel robe, she found Jonathan standing by the window with 2 cups of coffee from the room's small machine. "Peace offering," he said, holding one out to her. "It's terrible hotel coffee, but it's caffeine." Rebecca accepted the cup, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. His hands were warm, calloused in a way that surprised her. Even billionaires, apparently, had histories written in their skin. "Thank you," she said, and meant it for more than just the coffee. They sat on their respective beds, facing each other across the narrow space between them. The dim hotel lighting was kinder than the harsh terminal fluorescence, but it also felt more intimate, more real. "Can I ask you something?" Rebecca said finally. Jonathan nodded, wariness flickering in his eyes. "How often does that happen? What happened on the plane, I mean?" He was quiet for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was matter-of-fact, as if he was discussing the weather. "More than you'd think, less than it used to be." The simple honesty of it made her throat tight. "I'm sorry. For the question. For being part of that statistic." Jonathan studied her face in the soft light. Something in his expression had changed. Not forgiveness, exactly, but a recognition that her apology was different from the ones he'd heard before. "You want to know the strangest part?" he said. "I almost moved when you first asked. Not because I thought you were right, but because it was easier than dealing with the scene I knew was coming." Rebecca felt the words like a physical blow. "But you didn't." "No, I decided I was tired of making other people's comfort more important than my own dignity." The power went out. The room plunged into complete darkness, the hum of the air conditioning cutting off abruptly. Emergency lighting flickered on in the hallway outside their door, casting thin strips of illumination under the doorframe, but inside their room they were enveloped in soft blackness. "Well," Jonathan's voice came from the darkness, and she could hear something that might have been amusement. "I guess we're really stuck together now." Despite everything, the humiliation, the awkwardness, the weight of what lay between them, Rebecca found herself laughing. Not the polished laugh she used in business meetings, but something genuine and surprised. "I guess we are," she said. And in that moment, sitting in darkness with a man whose name she'd only learned a few hours ago, Rebecca felt something she hadn't experienced in years, the possibility that being stuck might not be the worst thing that could happen to her. Sometimes our most uncomfortable moments become our most transformative ones. What's a time when being stuck in a difficult situation led to unexpected growth or connection? Share your story below. I'm genuinely curious to hear how discomfort has shaped your relationships. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside room 314, something between Rebecca and Jonathan had begun to shift in the darkness. The darkness had a weight to it, pressing down on the careful distance they'd maintained since entering the room. Rebecca could hear Jonathan's breathing steady and calm, somewhere across the narrow space between their beds. Without the ability to see his expressions, to read the guarded politeness in his eyes, everything felt different, more honest somehow. "I used to be afraid of the dark," Rebecca said suddenly, surprised by her own voice breaking the silence. "Used to be. Until I was 8. My parents went through this horrible divorce, and I spent a lot of nights hiding in closets, listening to them scream at each other." She pulled her knees up to her chest, grateful he couldn't see the gesture. "After a while, I realized the dark was actually safer than the light. In the dark, nobody could see you crying." She heard rustling as Jonathan shifted on his bed. "What changed?" "My mom remarried. A good man who installed nightlights in every room and never raised his voice." Rebecca smiled in the darkness. Suddenly the dark felt lonely instead of safe. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It felt like an invitation. "I was 12 when I learned what people really see when they look at me," Jonathan said finally. Rebecca held her breath, afraid that speaking might break whatever spell was allowing this honesty. "I was at a country club with my mom. She worked in the kitchen there. The manager's son had forgotten his tennis racket, and my mom asked me to bring it to the courts. His voice was matter-of-fact, but she could hear the 12-year-old boy underneath it. I found him playing with 2 other kids, so I walked over and said, "Excuse me, you forgot your racket." Rebecca closed her eyes, already knowing where this story was going. The kid looked at me like I'd crawled out from under a rock. Then he said loud enough for everyone to hear, "I don't take things from the help." His friend laughed and said something about knowing my place. "What did you do?" I set the racket down and walked away. Didn't say a word. Jonathan's voice carried a weight that spoke of years of similar moments. But that night, I promised myself I'd make enough money that nobody would ever dismiss me like that again. Did it work? Jonathan's laugh was hollow. Money changes how people treat you, but it doesn't change what they're thinking. They just get better at hiding it, more polite in their assumptions. Rebecca felt something twist in her chest, like I was today. "You weren't polite about it." The words stung because they were true. She'd been direct in her dismissal, unapologetic in her assumption that she belonged in that seat more than he did. In some ways, that might have been more honest than polite prejudice, but it wasn't less hurtful. "I got married young," Rebecca said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. 22, right out of college. Brad was everything my parents wanted for me, MBA from Wharton, family money, the right connections. What did you want? The question caught her off guard. I thought I wanted the same things: security, status, the kind of life where you never have to worry about belonging anywhere. She pulled the hotel comforter tighter around her shoulders. Turns out marrying someone for their last name doesn't actually make you worthy of carrying it. What happened? I spent 8 years trying to be the wife he needed for his career. The right clothes, the right parties, the right opinions expressed at the right volume. Rebecca's voice grew smaller. But I was never quite right enough. Too ambitious, too outspoken, too focused on my own career, instead of supporting his. So you got divorced. He got divorced. I got replaced with someone younger, quieter, more grateful for the opportunity to be Mrs. Brad Williams. The bitterness in her own voice surprised her. The prenup meant I got to keep my maiden name and not much else. That's why you hyphenated. Chen Williams. She nodded in the darkness, then remembered he couldn't see her. I couldn't decide which name felt more like mine. Chen felt like childhood, like someone I used to be. Williams felt like a costume I'd worn for 8 years. So I kept both and hoped they'd eventually feel like they belonged together. Do they? Rebecca considered the question. Some days. Other days I feel like I'm 2 different people pretending to be one person, and neither of them knows what they're doing. The hotel room's heating system kicked on with a gentle hum, the only sound besides their breathing. Rebecca found herself thinking about the presentation she'd been so desperate to prepare for, the partnership she'd been certain would finally prove her worth. In the darkness, with Jonathan's quiet presence across from her, it all seemed suddenly less important than understanding why she'd felt the need to prove anything at all. "Can I tell you something embarrassing?" she asked. "More embarrassing than trying to kick the airline owner out of his own seat?" Despite everything, Rebecca laughed. "When I saw you in that seat, before I even spoke to you, I made a whole story in my head about who you were. I decided you were probably flying on points or an upgrade, maybe military, or some kind of staff discount. I never even considered that you might belong there more than I did." Why? The question was gentle, curious rather than accusatory, but it hit harder than anger would have. "Because in my world, people who look like you." She stopped, the words feeling ugly in her mouth. "Go ahead," Jonathan said quietly. "Say it." "In my world, successful people look like Brad, like me, like the people in the boardrooms and country clubs where I learned what success was supposed to look like." The admission felt like bleeding. "I know how awful that sounds. I know it's wrong, but when I saw you, some part of my brain that I didn't even know existed just made assumptions." The silence that followed felt different, heavier, more fragile. "You want to know the worst part?" Jonathan's voice was so quiet she had to strain to hear it. "I almost believed you had more right to that seat than I did. For just a second, when you first spoke, part of me thought maybe I'd made a mistake, maybe I'd misread my boarding pass or forgotten some rule I should have known." Rebecca felt tears she hadn't expected sliding down her cheeks. "Jonathan, I've been flying first class for 10 years, and I still get that feeling sometimes, like I'm an imposter who's going to be found out, asked to move to where I really belong. But you own the airline. Doesn't matter. The doubt lives in here." He tapped his chest, though she couldn't see the gesture. "Every time someone looks at me like they're trying to figure out what I'm doing in their space, it feeds that voice that says maybe they're right." Rebecca wiped her eyes with the hotel robe sleeve, grateful for the darkness that hid her tears. "I'm so sorry I was one of those people." "You're not anymore." The simple statement hit her with unexpected force. Not forgiveness, exactly, but something more valuable: recognition that people could change, could grow beyond their worst moments. Outside, she could hear the wind beginning to die down, the storm that had brought them together finally starting to pass. Soon the power would come back on, morning would arrive, and they'd return to their separate lives and separate worlds. But something had shifted between them in the darkness, something that would be impossible to unsee in the light. "Rebecca." Jonathan's voice came through the darkness, softer than she'd heard it before. "Yeah? Thank you for asking the question." "What question?" "How often it happens. Most people pretend they don't see it, or they see it and decide it's not their problem. You're the first person who's ever asked how it felt." Rebecca closed her eyes, understanding that he'd just given her something precious, not absolution for her behavior, but trust that she might be capable of something better. The heating system cycled off, leaving them in complete silence except for the gradually quieting storm outside. And in that silence, Rebecca began to understand that some connections could only be forged in darkness, when all the surface things that divided people fell away and left only the truth of who they really were underneath. Rebecca woke to pale morning light filtering through thin hotel curtains and the sound of quiet movement across the room. For a moment, she was disoriented, unsure where she was or why she felt so emotionally raw. Then memory flooded back: the plane, the confrontation, the storm, and hours of honest conversation in the darkness with a man who was supposed to be a stranger. She kept her eyes closed, listening to Jonathan move around the room with careful quietness, trying not to wake her. The considerate gesture felt intimate in a way that made her chest tighten. When had she last shared space with someone who thought about her comfort? "I know you're awake," he said softly, and she could hear the smile in his voice. "Your breathing changed." Rebecca opened her eyes to find Jonathan sitting at the small table, already dressed, with 2 cups of coffee and what looked like continental breakfast items spread out between them. The power was back on, but he'd kept the overhead lights off, letting the natural morning light create a softer atmosphere. "You went downstairs?" she asked, sitting up and suddenly conscious that she was still in the hotel robe, her hair probably a disaster. "Couldn't sleep after about 5, so I figured I might as well make myself useful." He gestured to the spread. "Hotel breakfast isn't much, but there's coffee and some passable pastries." Rebecca looked at the small feast he'd assembled. Coffee fixed the way she'd mentioned liking it during their late-night conversation, a blueberry muffin her favorite, which had somehow come up when they were talking about childhood memories, and even a small container of real cream, instead of the artificial stuff the hotel usually provided. "You remember what I said about the cream," she said, touched by the attention to detail. "You said your stepfather used to make you hot chocolate with real cream on Sunday mornings." Figured coffee was close enough. Jonathan's expression was almost shy. "The kitchen staff was setting up for the day, and when I explained about the power outage, they were happy to help. It was such a simple thing: breakfast, coffee, the kind of morning consideration that should have been ordinary. But Rebecca couldn't remember the last time someone had paid attention to what she actually wanted instead of what they thought she should want. "Thank you," she said, meaning it for more than just the food. As she moved to the table, she caught sight of herself in the mirror and winced. Her hair was indeed a disaster, her face bare of makeup, the hotel robe making her look like she'd survived some kind of natural disaster, which, she supposed, she had. "I look terrible," she said automatically, then caught herself. Why was she apologizing for her appearance to this man who'd seen her at her worst in every other way? "You look real," Jonathan said simply. "It's a good look on you." Something in his tone made her actually look at him. Really look. Without the baseball cap, his hair was shorter than she'd expected, with threads of early silver at the temples that somehow made him look distinguished rather than older. His eyes, which had been so guarded on the plane, were warmer this morning, more open. The simple jeans and sweater he wore looked expensive in the way that truly good clothes always did, understated but perfectly fitted. But it was more than his appearance. There was something different about his posture, the way he held himself. Less defensive maybe, more present. "You look different too," she said, settling across from him at the small table. "Different how?" "Less like you're waiting for bad news." Jonathan considered this, rotating his coffee cup in his hands. "Maybe I am. Less waiting, I mean." They ate in companionable silence, and Rebecca marveled at how natural it felt. She'd shared countless business breakfasts, quick morning routines with Brad, even vacation mornings with friends, but they'd all felt performative somehow. This felt like simply existing in the same space with someone who understood her presence without needing it to be anything more than what it was. "Can I ask you something that might be too personal?" Rebecca said, then continued before he could answer. "Yesterday when I was talking to you like you didn't belong in first class, was that the worst it's been, or is that just Tuesday for you?" Jonathan was quiet for a long moment, but his expression wasn't closed off like it had been on the plane. "It wasn't the worst," he said finally, "but it might have been the most disappointing." "Why?" "Because you seemed smart, successful, the kind of person who should know better." He met her eyes. "I've been dismissed by ignorant people, and it rolls off because I can tell myself they don't know any better. But when someone like you makes those assumptions, it hurts more because you expect more." "Exactly." Rebecca felt the familiar sting of shame, but it was different now, cleaner, somehow. Not the desperate mortification of being caught in wrongdoing, but the productive discomfort of understanding a mistake well enough to avoid repeating it. "I've been thinking about what you said last night, about almost believing I had more right to that seat than you did." She pulled her knees up to her chest, wrapping her arms around them. "I spent 8 years in my marriage doing that, almost believing that Brad's friends and family were right, that I was lucky to be included in their world and should be grateful instead of expecting to belong there. But you did belong there, you earned your place. Did I? Or was I just another diversity hire for Brad's social circle?" The Asian wife who made him look progressive and international. The bitterness in her voice surprised her. "I never knew for sure, and that uncertainty ate at me every day." Jonathan leaned forward, his expression intense. "You know what the difference is between you and me." "What?" "You questioning whether you belong somewhere means you're thoughtful enough to consider other perspectives, humble enough to doubt your own assumptions. When I doubt whether I belong, it's because the world has spent 36 years telling me I don't, no matter what I achieve." Rebecca stared at him, something clicking into place. "We're both carrying around other people's voices." "Yeah. The difference is, your voice is telling you that you might not be good enough. Mine is telling me that I'll never be acceptable." They sat with that realization for a moment, the weight of recognition settling between them. Outside, Rebecca could hear the sounds of the hotel coming alive, housekeeping carts rattling down hallways, elevators chiming, the distant hum of travelers returning to their interrupted journeys. "I have a confession," Jonathan said suddenly. When I saw you arguing with that gate agent yesterday, before we boarded, I thought you were everything I hate about entitled passengers." Rebecca laughed, surprising herself. "I probably was everything you hate about entitled passengers. Maybe, but you're also funny, and smart, and brave enough to admit when you're wrong." His smile was tentative but genuine, "and you make terrible coffee jokes in the middle of emotional conversations." "I do not make terrible coffee jokes. Last night you said our hotel coffee was grounds for complaint, and then laughed at your own pun for 5 minutes." Rebecca felt her cheeks warm. It was funny. It was terrible, but your laugh— Jonathan's expression grew serious. "I haven't heard anyone laugh like that in a long time, like they actually found something genuinely amusing instead of just being polite." There was something in his voice that made Rebecca's heart skip, not just attraction though that was definitely there, but recognition. The way he said it made her realize how long it had been since she'd laughed genuinely at anything, how much of her life had become performance. "Jonathan," she said carefully, "what happens when we go back to the real world?" "What do you mean?" "I mean, yesterday I was a marketing executive who made racist assumptions about a stranger on a plane. You were a billionaire who probably gets propositioned by gold diggers on a weekly basis." She gestured between them. "This, whatever this is, it happened in a bubble, storm, darkness, forced proximity. What happens when we're back in our normal lives?" Jonathan was quiet for a long time, considering the question with the same seriousness he'd given everything else they'd discussed. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know I don't want to go back to pretending yesterday didn't happen." "Even the bad parts?" "Especially the bad parts. The bad parts taught us something." Rebecca looked at him across the small table, this man who'd shown her grace she hadn't deserved, who'd trusted her with stories that still carried childhood pain, who'd somehow made her feel more seen in 18 hours than she'd felt in 8 years of marriage. "I don't want to go back to pretending either," she said quietly. The words hung between them, fragile and full of possibility. Through the hotel room window, Rebecca could see airport shuttles beginning their morning runs, carrying passengers back to their postponed flights and interrupted plans. Soon they'd be back on the plane to Seattle, returning to the separate lives and separate worlds that had shaped them into the people who'd collided so spectacularly over a seat assignment. But for now, in the soft morning light of a hotel room they'd never planned to share, they were just two people who'd found something unexpected in the darkness, understanding, connection, and the beginning of something that might be love. "Rebecca," Jonathan's voice was soft. "Yeah? I'm glad you took my seat." She smiled, feeling lighter than she had in months. "I'm glad you didn't move." The shuttle back to the airport felt like a countdown to the end of something precious. Rebecca sat beside Jonathan in comfortable silence, watching the morning sun burn off the last remnants of the storm clouds. In a few hours, they'd be in Seattle, she to her rescheduled presentation, he to whatever business had brought him there in the first place. The thought made her chest tight with an anxiety she didn't want to examine too closely. "Flight 447 to Seattle is now boarding all passengers," the gate announcement crackled through the terminal speakers as they approached their gate. "Back to reality," Rebecca said, trying to keep her tone light. Jonathan squeezed her hand briefly, a gesture so natural she didn't realize it had happened until he'd already let go. Some realities are better than others. They boarded together this time, no conflict over seats, no assumptions or misunderstandings. Jonathan had quietly arranged for Rebecca to be moved to 3B, the seat beside his, though she hadn't asked him to and he hadn't made a show of it. It was the kind of thoughtful gesture she was learning was typical of him, solving problems without fanfare, making space for people in ways they didn't even know they needed. As they settled in for the flight to Seattle, Rebecca felt a strange mixture of contentment and apprehension. The contentment was easy to understand. She was sitting beside a man who'd somehow become important to her in less than 24 hours, someone who saw her clearly and still chose to be there. The apprehension was harder to name, but it felt like the anticipation of loss, as if she was already mourning something that hadn't ended yet. "Rebecca? Oh my God, Rebecca!" The voice cut through her thoughts like a knife. She turned to see Melissa Chang, her closest colleague at Patterson and Associates, approaching their row with the kind of aggressive friendliness that usually meant trouble. "Mel," Rebecca managed, her stomach dropping. "What are you doing on this flight?" "Same storm delay as you, apparently." "I was trying to get to the Portland office for the Henderson account review." Melissa's eyes flicked curiously to Jonathan, then back to Rebecca with an expression that was equal parts concern and gossip-hungry interest. "I was so worried when you didn't answer your phone last night. The hotel said the power was out, and I thought—" Her gaze moved to Jonathan again, and Rebecca watched her colleague's mental calculations in real time. "Melissa Chang, this is Jonathan Rivers," Rebecca said carefully. "Jonathan, this is my colleague Melissa." "Pleasure to meet you," Jonathan said, standing to shake Melissa's hand with the same quiet courtesy he'd shown everyone else. But Rebecca could see the subtle shift in his posture, the way his expression became more carefully neutral. The walls were going back up. "Rivers," Melissa repeated, her eyes narrowing slightly. "Why does that name sound familiar?" Rebecca felt her heart start to race. She could see exactly where this was heading, could practically hear the wheels turning in Melissa's head. In about 30 seconds, her colleague was going to figure out who Jonathan was, and then, "Oh my God!" Melissa's voice dropped to what she probably thought was a whisper, but carried clearly through the first-class cabin. "You're the airline guy, Skybridge Airlines. I saw you on the Forbes list last month." The shift in the cabin was immediate and uncomfortable. Conversations paused, heads turned, and Rebecca felt the weight of curious stares settling on them like a spotlight she couldn't escape. "I am," Jonathan said simply, but Rebecca could see him retreating even as he sat perfectly still. "This is so crazy." Melissa's voice had gotten louder, her excitement overriding any sense of discretion. "Rebecca, do you know who you're sitting with? This guy is worth like what, $3 billion? Rebecca felt heat creep up her neck as more passengers turned to stare. She could see Jonathan's jaw tighten almost imperceptibly, could feel him pulling away from her even though he hadn't physically moved. "Mel," Rebecca said quietly, "maybe we could— I mean, this is incredible. How did you two meet? Are you dating?" "Oh my God, Rebecca, your life is like a movie." Melissa's voice carried the kind of manic energy that came from someone who thought they were witnessing something extraordinary and wanted to be part of it. "We're not," Rebecca started, then stopped. "What were they? Friends? Something more?" She looked at Jonathan and saw something die in his expression, some light going out behind his eyes. "It's not like that," Rebecca finished lamely. The words hung in the air like a slap. Jonathan didn't visibly react, but Rebecca felt the distance open between them as surely as if he'd physically moved seats. Around them, the whispered conversations had started up again, speculation about the billionaire and the woman sitting beside him, assumptions about gold diggers and opportunistic encounters that made Rebecca's skin crawl. "Oh," Melissa said, clearly disappointed. "Well, still, what are the odds? I mean, first the seat mix-up yesterday. Wait." Her expression changed, memory clicking into place. "Yesterday. Oh my God, Rebecca, the seat thing you texted about, was that?" She looked between Rebecca and Jonathan with growing understanding and horror. Rebecca closed her eyes, wishing she could disappear into her seat. Of course Melissa would put it together. Of course the one person who knew about Rebecca's awkward encounter would be the one to connect all the dots in the most public way possible. "You were the one who," Melissa started. "Who got put in his place?" "Yeah," Rebecca said quietly, feeling the weight of shame and embarrassment crash back down on her. In the bubble of the hotel room, with just the two of them and their honest conversation, the seat incident had become part of their story, painful but necessary, a catalyst for understanding. Now, with Melissa's loud voice and curious stares from other passengers, it felt sordid and humiliating again. Jonathan stood abruptly. "I think I'll stretch my legs," he said, his voice politely distant. "Jonathan, wait." Rebecca started, but he was already walking toward the back of the plane, leaving her sitting there with Melissa's wide eyes and the whispered conversations of people who thought they understood what they'd witnessed. "Rebecca," Melissa said, sliding uninvited into Jonathan's vacant seat, "what the hell is going on? Did you know who he was yesterday when you texted me about the seat thing?" "No," Rebecca said numbly. "I found out the hard way." "And then what? You guys bonded over your mutual humiliation? This is so weird, Becca. I mean, he's a billionaire. What could you possibly have in common?" The question hit Rebecca like a physical blow, not because it was cruel. Melissa wasn't trying to be mean, but because it reflected exactly the kind of thinking that had gotten her into this mess in the first place. The assumption that connection could only exist between people who looked similar on paper, that differences in background or wealth made understanding impossible. "You wouldn't understand," Rebecca said quietly. "Try me." "No, Mel, I mean you literally wouldn't understand, because understanding would require you to see him as something other than a bank account with legs." Melissa's expression shifted, hurt replacing curiosity. "That's not fair. I'm just trying to look out for you. Guys like that don't date women like us for the right reasons." "Women like us?" "You know what I mean. Regular women. Women who aren't models or heiresses or whatever. Men with that kind of money can have anyone, so why would they choose someone normal unless—" "Unless what, Melissa? Unless they're slumming it, or you're offering something specific, or—" Melissa stopped, apparently realizing how she sounded. Rebecca stared at her colleague, someone she'd considered a friend, someone she'd shared drinks and complained about work with for 3 years. The casual cruelty of the assumptions, the immediate leap to transactional explanations for any connection between her and Jonathan, felt like a window into exactly the kind of thinking that had made Jonathan build walls around his heart in the first place. "I need some air," Rebecca said, standing up. She found Jonathan in the back galley, staring out one of the small windows at the clouds below. He didn't turn when she approached, but his shoulders tensed, as if he was bracing for another blow. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "About Melissa, about the scene, about—" "About what?" His voice was carefully neutral. "About your colleague assuming I'm your sugar daddy, or about you looking like you wanted to disappear when she figured out who I was." The words stung, because they were partially true. She had wanted to disappear, but not for the reasons he thought. "I wanted to disappear because I was embarrassed," Rebecca said. "Not of you, of the situation, of having our private connection turned into entertainment for a plane full of strangers." Jonathan finally turned to look at her, and she could see he was back to the guarded, distant man she'd first met on the plane yesterday. "Your friend asked what we could possibly have in common. What did you tell her?" "I told her she wouldn't understand." "That's not an answer, Rebecca. What do we have in common? Beyond shared trauma and proximity?" His voice was getting quieter, more controlled, which somehow made it worse than if he'd been angry. "What happens when we land in Seattle and go back to our real lives? When you go back to your marketing job and I go back to board meetings and investment portfolios?" Rebecca felt something cracking inside her chest. "I don't know, but does that mean it wasn't real?" "Real?" Jonathan's laugh was bitter. "Your colleague took one look at us and assumed you were either after my money or I was slumming it. That's what the real world thinks about connections like this." "Since when do you care what other people think?" "Since I remembered why I stopped trying to make connections in the first place." Jonathan's expression was shutting down, becoming the polite mask she'd seen him wear with the flight attendant yesterday. This was a mistake. The words hit Rebecca like ice water. What was a mistake? thinking this could be different, thinking you could be different. I am different. Are you? Jonathan's eyes were sad rather than angry, which was worse, because when your colleagues started making assumptions, you couldn't get away from me fast enough. You couldn't even say we were friends, let alone anything more. Rebecca opened her mouth to argue, then realized he was right. When Melissa had asked if they were dating, she'd immediately denied it. Not because it wasn't true, she didn't even know if it was true, but because being seen that way, being judged that way, had felt overwhelming. Jonathan, the pilot just announced our descent into Seattle, he said, cutting her off. You should get back to your seat. Prepare for landing. He walked past her without another word, leaving Rebecca standing alone in the back galley, understanding that whatever had bloomed between them in the darkness of a hotel room was withering in the harsh light of public scrutiny and her own cowardice. By the time she made it back to her seat, Jonathan had returned to his, but he might as well have been sitting in another country. The careful distance between them felt infinite, and Rebecca realized that some things once broken couldn't be put back together simply by wanting them to be whole. 3 hours after landing in Seattle, Rebecca sat in the glass-walled conference room at Patterson and Associates, staring at her Morrison presentation slides without seeing them. The numbers and charts blurred together as her mind replayed the devastating conversation in the airplane galley over and over again. Thinking you could be different. The words echoed in her head as her colleagues filtered into the conference room, their voices a distant hum of preparation and caffeine-fueled energy. This was supposed to be her moment, the presentation that would secure her partnership, validate 8 years of climbing the corporate ladder, prove once and for all that she belonged in rooms like this one. Instead, all she could think about was the look in Jonathan's eyes when he'd walked away from her. Rebecca, her assistant's voice cut through her reverie. The Morrison team is joining us in 5 minutes. Are you ready? Ready. Was anyone ever ready to discover who they really were when it mattered most? Almost, Rebecca said, forcing her attention back to her laptop screen. But as she scrolled through the presentation, market analysis, demographic breakdowns, consumer behavior patterns, every slide felt like evidence of how little she actually understood about people. How could she claim expertise in human connection and motivation when she'd just failed the most basic test of standing by someone who mattered to her? Her phone buzzed with a text from Melissa. Hope the presentation goes well. Still can't believe you met a billionaire. What are the odds? Rebecca deleted the message without responding. The odds, as it turned out, were irrelevant. Meeting Jonathan hadn't been about probability, it had been about possibility. The possibility of connection that transcended assumptions and social barriers. The possibility of being seen and accepted for who she actually was, not who she pretended to be. The possibility she'd just thrown away because she was too afraid to claim it publicly. Her phone rang. Her mother. Hi, Mom. Honey, how did the presentation go? I've been thinking about you all morning. It's in 2 minutes, actually. Oh, well, I know you'll be brilliant. You always are when it matters. Her mother's voice carried that particular blend of pride and worry that had followed Rebecca through every major moment of her adult life. Your father and I are so proud of what you've built, sweetie. This partnership will change everything for you. Will it? Rebecca found herself wondering, or would it just be another external validation that left her feeling just as empty as the last one? Mom, can I ask you something? Of course, honey. When you married Dad, did you ever worry that you were marrying him for the wrong reasons? For security, instead of love? The silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that Rebecca wondered if the call had dropped. Why are you asking me this? Her mother said finally. Just curious. Rebecca, your father was many things, but security wasn't one of them. He was a graduate student with no money and big dreams when I met him. I married him because he made me laugh and saw things in me I didn't know were there. Her mother's voice grew softer. Security came later, after years of building something together, but it was never the foundation. Rebecca felt something shift in her chest. What was the foundation? Recognition. The feeling that he saw who I really was and liked that person better than the version of myself I thought I was supposed to be. The words hit Rebecca like a physical blow. Recognition. Isn't that exactly what she'd found with Jonathan? The feeling of being seen clearly, flaws and assumptions and all, and still being worthy of consideration, of care, of genuine connection. Mom, I have to go. The presentation, right? Good luck, honey. I love you. I love you too. Rebecca hung up and stared at her reflection in the conference room window. She looked exactly like what she was, a successful marketing executive in an expensive suit, preparing to give the presentation that would define her career trajectory. But underneath the polished exterior, she could see the woman who'd sat in hotel darkness, admitting her prejudices to a man who had every reason to dismiss her but chose understanding instead. Which version of herself was she going to be today? Her laptop chimed with an incoming video call from the Morrison team. This was it. The moment she'd worked toward for years, the validation she'd convinced herself she needed. But as she reached for the mouse to accept the call, Rebecca found herself thinking about Jonathan's voice when he'd said, "I decided I was tired of making other people's comfort more important than my own dignity." What if dignity wasn't just about refusing to be diminished? What if it was also about refusing to diminish yourself by settling for less than you deserved, professionally, personally, emotionally? Rebecca closed her laptop. "Cancel the call," she told her assistant, who was hovering by the door. "I'm sorry." "What?" "Cancel the Morrison presentation. Tell them I'll reschedule for tomorrow." "Rebecca, you can't just—" "I can, and I am." Rebecca was already gathering her things, her heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilaration. "There's something I need to do first." She was out of the building and in her car before she allowed herself to fully process what she'd just done. She'd canceled the most important presentation of her career to chase after a man who might not want to see her, to try to repair something she'd broken through her own cowardice. It was possibly the stupidest professional decision she'd ever made. It was also possibly the bravest personal decision she'd ever made. 20 minutes later, Rebecca stood in the marble lobby of the Skybridge Airlines corporate headquarters, her heart hammering against her ribs. The receptionist, a polished young man who looked like he'd stepped out of a corporate recruitment brochure, regarded her with professional courtesy tinged with skepticism. "I'm sorry, Miss Chen Williams, but Mr. Rivers doesn't have any appointments available today. If you'd like to schedule something for next week." "Please," Rebecca interrupted, then caught herself. Please. When had she started begging for access to spaces she thought she deserved to occupy? "I mean, could you just tell him Rebecca is here? He'll know who I am." The receptionist's expression suggested that many people claimed Mr. Rivers would know who they were, and most of them were wrong. "I'm afraid that's not how our scheduling system works," he said with the kind of polite firmness that was clearly designed to repel casual fortune seekers and social climbers. Rebecca felt the familiar heat of embarrassment creeping up her neck. Here she was again, a woman trying to talk her way into a space where she wasn't wanted, making assumptions about her importance to someone who might have already forgotten she existed. But this time felt different. This time she wasn't assuming she deserved access because of her job title or her boarding pass or her place in some social hierarchy. She was asking for access because of something real that had happened between two people in a moment of genuine connection. The question was, did she have the courage to fight for it? "Fine," Rebecca said, pulling out her phone. "I'll wait." She found a chair in the lobby's seating area and settled in with the determination of someone who'd finally figured out what she was fighting for. Around her, Skybridge employees moved with purpose through the gleaming space, their conversations a low hum of productivity and professional urgency. She'd wait here all day if she had to. She'd wait until security escorted her out, or Jonathan came down to see her, or she figured out some other way to prove that what they'd shared wasn't just proximity and circumstance. Because her mother was right, recognition was the foundation of everything that mattered, and Jonathan had recognized her, had seen through her defenses and assumptions to something worth caring about. The least she could do was return the favor. Have you ever had to choose between comfort and courage? Between taking the safe path and fighting for something that scared you? I'd love to hear about a time when you had to decide what was worth risking everything for. Share your story in the comments. Rebecca pulled out her phone and began typing a text she hoped she'd have the courage to send. "I'm sitting in your lobby and I'm not leaving until we talk. I know I screwed up, but what we found was real, and I'm tired of pretending it wasn't." Jonathan Rivers sat in his corner office 37 floors above the lobby, where Rebecca waited, staring at her text message on his phone screen. The words had arrived 20 minutes ago, and he'd read them so many times he could recite them from memory. "I'm sitting in your lobby and I'm not leaving until we talk. I know I screwed up, but what we found was real, and I'm tired of pretending it wasn't." Through his floor-to-ceiling windows, he could see Elliott Bay stretching toward the Olympic Mountains, ferries crossing the gray-blue water like toys in a bathtub. It was the same view that had inspired him to buy this building 5 years ago, the same view that usually filled him with satisfaction about how far he'd come from that 12-year-old boy with the tennis racket. Today, it just looked like distance. His assistant had informed him about Rebecca's arrival with the practiced neutrality of someone who'd seen plenty of unexpected visitors over the years. "She says you'll know who she is, sir. Should I have security escort her out?" Jonathan had almost said yes. Almost. The familiar protective instincts had kicked in immediately: remove the threat, maintain the walls, avoid the possibility of further disappointment. It would have been easy, clean, final. But something had stopped him. Maybe it was the memory of her laugh in the hotel darkness, or the way she'd looked when she admitted her assumptions to him, or the simple fact that she was here at all, risking public embarrassment to ask for a conversation he had every right to refuse. What we found was real. Was it? Or had it just been two lonely people finding temporary comfort in forced proximity, mistaking shared vulnerability for genuine connection? Jonathan's phone buzzed with another message, this one from his mother. "I made dinner reservations for 3 people on Sunday, just in case you change your mind about bringing someone special." He smiled despite himself. Evelyn Rivers had been making dinner reservations for 3 people for the past 5 years, her unwavering optimism in the face of his romantic disasters both touching and exhausting. "What would you think of her, Mom?" he found himself wondering. A white marketing executive who'd initially dismissed him, who'd stumbled through apologies and assumptions, who'd denied their connection the moment it became public. On paper, Rebecca Chen Williams was everything his mother had warned him about, someone who might see his success before she saw him. But in the darkness of that hotel room, she'd become something else entirely. Someone who'd asked how it felt to be dismissed. Someone who'd shared her own stories of not belonging, of trying to earn love instead of simply accepting it. Someone who'd laughed at terrible puns and cried over childhood wounds and made him remember what it felt like to be seen. His desk phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Rivers?" His assistant's voice was carefully professional. "The woman in the lobby, she's been there for 45 minutes now, and she's started working on what appears to be a presentation. Security is asking how you'd like to proceed." Jonathan closed his eyes, imagining Rebecca in his corporate lobby, probably pulling out her laptop and treating his marble floor like an extension of her office, too stubborn to leave, and too determined to give up. It was exactly the kind of thing she would do. Direct, slightly presumptuous, completely sincere. "Send her up," he said quietly. "Sir? You heard me. Send her up." 10 minutes later, his office door opened and Rebecca walked in, looking like she'd prepared for battle. Her suit was immaculate, her hair perfectly styled, her professional armor fully in place. But Jonathan could see the uncertainty in her eyes, the way she held herself like someone who'd just jumped off a cliff and wasn't sure if she'd packed a parachute. "Thank you for seeing me," she said, standing just inside the doorway as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to come farther. "You didn't leave me much choice." But his tone was curious rather than angry. "My assistant said you were working on a presentation in my lobby." Rebecca's cheeks flushed slightly. "I canceled the most important presentation of my career to come here. Figured I might as well put the nervous energy to use." "You canceled the Morrison presentation?" "Rescheduled, for tomorrow." She lifted her chin with a gesture that reminded him of her confidence on the airplane before everything had gotten complicated. "Turns out some things are more important than professional advancement." Jonathan gestured to the chairs across from his desk. "Sit, please." She moved carefully, settling into the leather chair like she wasn't sure it would hold her. For a moment, they simply looked at each other across the expanse of his desk, the same two people who'd shared coffee and secrets in a darkened hotel room, now separated by mahogany and glass and the weight of everything that had been said and unsaid between them. "I owe you an apology," Rebecca said finally. "For what? Believing your colleague when she made assumptions about us? Denying we were dating when we weren't actually dating? Being embarrassed by the attention?" Jonathan's voice was calm, but she could hear the hurt underneath it. "Which part specifically?" "For all of it, but mostly for failing you when it mattered." The simple honesty of it caught him off guard. "How did you fail me?" "When Melissa started talking about what we could have in common, when she reduced you to your net worth and me to whatever she thought I was getting out of being near you, I should have defended what we found. I should have stood up and said that you're brilliant and kind and funny, that you made me feel seen in ways I'd forgotten were possible." Rebecca's voice grew stronger as she spoke. "Instead I got scared. Scared of judgment. Scared of what people would think. Scared of claiming something I wasn't sure I deserved." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, studying her face. "And what changed?" "I realized that what other people think doesn't matter if I lose the person whose opinion actually counts." She met his eyes directly. "I realized that I'd spent so much time trying to earn my place in rooms like this that I forgot the only room that matters is the one where someone chooses to stay." The words hung between them, honest and vulnerable, and completely without artifice. Jonathan felt something shift in his chest, the careful walls he'd rebuilt starting to crack again. "Rebecca," he said quietly, "what are you asking for?" "A chance to start over, to have the conversation we should have had on the plane before everything got complicated." She leaned forward, her professional composure giving way to something more real. "Hi, I'm Rebecca Chen Williams. I'm 34 years old, recently divorced, and I work in marketing. I have terrible taste in romantic comedies, I make coffee puns when I'm nervous, and I sometimes make assumptions about people that I immediately regret." Despite everything, Jonathan found himself smiling. And yesterday I met someone who challenged everything I thought I knew about connection and belonging. Someone who showed me grace I didn't deserve and trusted me with stories that mattered. Someone who made me want to be better than I was." "What happened to that someone?" "I hurt him, because I was more afraid of what other people thought than I was committed to what we'd found together." Rebecca's voice grew quiet. "But I'm here now hoping maybe it's not too late to prove that I can choose courage over comfort." Jonathan stood up slowly, walking around his desk to the wall of windows overlooking the city. Rebecca watched him, her heart hammering against her ribs as she waited for his response. "You know what the hardest part of being successful has been," he said finally, not turning around. "Not the long hours or the business pressures, or even the isolation. It's the constant wondering whether people see Jonathan or just the money, whether connections are real or transactional. And what do you wonder about me?" He turned to face her then, his expression serious but no longer guarded. "Honestly, I wonder if you're brave enough to find out who we could be together, outside of hotel rooms and airplane emergencies." Rebecca stood up, crossing to where he stood by the windows. The city spread out below them, millions of people going about their lives, making connections and taking risks, and choosing each other despite all the reasons they could find not to. "I'm brave enough to try," she said quietly. "If you are." Jonathan looked at her, really looked, the way he had in the hotel room darkness when nothing existed except honesty and possibility. "I have one condition." "What?" "Next time someone asks what we have in common, you don't get to claim we're just friends." Rebecca smiled, feeling lighter than she had since walking away from him on the airplane. "Deal, but I have a condition too." "What's that?" "Next time someone tries to reduce you to your bank account, I get to tell them exactly what I think of that assessment." Jonathan laughed, not the careful professional laugh she'd heard him use with his assistant, but the genuine, surprised laughter she remembered from their morning conversation over terrible hotel coffee. "Deal," he said, and leaned down to kiss her. It was their first kiss, soft and tentative and full of the promise of all the conversations they'd never had, all the assumptions they'd never make, all the mornings they might share if they were brave enough to keep choosing each other. When they finally broke apart, Rebecca rested her forehead against his, both of them breathing hard from the weight of what they'd just chosen. "So," she said, trying to sound casual and failing completely, "want to have dinner with me tonight? Somewhere public where people might make assumptions about us." "I thought you'd never ask," Jonathan replied, his arms tightening around her. Through the windows, Seattle sparkled in the afternoon sun, full of possibilities neither of them had imagined when they'd boarded that plane 24 hours ago. And in the reflection of the glass, they could see themselves clearly, not the successful executive and the billionaire, not the woman who'd made assumptions and the man who'd been dismissed, but two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely circumstances and chosen to fight for what they'd discovered. Sometimes the most beautiful love stories begin with the most uncomfortable truths about ourselves. What's a moment when facing your own prejudices or assumptions led to unexpected growth or connection? I believe our willingness to be honest about our flaws is what makes real love possible. Share your thoughts below. 3 months later, Rebecca sat in seat 3A on a Skybridge Airlines flight to Chicago, working on her laptop as Jonathan settled into 3B beside her. She was heading to a client presentation for her new marketing firm, the company she'd started after realizing that success meant nothing if it wasn't built on authenticity. He was flying commercial instead of taking his private jet because, as he'd told her with a grin, "The best things in my life have happened on airplanes." "Excuse me," Jonathan said in a mock-serious voice, "I think there might be some confusion about the seating arrangements." Rebecca looked up from her laptop, eyes twinkling. "Oh really? And what makes you think that?" "Well," he said, reaching into his jacket pocket, "I have this." He held up a small velvet box, "and I was hoping it might earn me the right to sit next to you on every flight for the rest of our lives." Rebecca's laptop slid forgotten to the floor as she stared at the ring, simple, elegant, perfect. Around them, other first-class passengers had begun to notice the scene unfolding, but this time she didn't care who was watching. "Jonathan Rivers," she said, her voice shaking with joy, "are you proposing to me at 30,000 feet? "Actually," he said with the grin she'd fallen in love with, "we're still on the ground. But I figured if I was going to ask you to spend your life with me, I should do it in the place where we learn to see each other clearly." Rebecca looked around the first-class cabin, remembering the woman she'd been the first time she'd sat in this seat, desperate to prove she belonged, afraid of being seen for who she really was, building walls instead of bridges. Then she looked at Jonathan, who saw all of her flaws and fears, and loved her anyway, who'd taught her that the only belonging that mattered was the kind you found with someone who chose to stay. "Yes," she said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. "Yes, absolutely, completely yes." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and the other passengers broke into applause, Rebecca realized that sometimes the seats we fight for aren't the ones we're meant to occupy. Sometimes the best place to be is right beside someone who sees past all our assumptions to the person we're brave enough to become. And sometimes, if you're very lucky, that person owns the entire airline.
If you enjoyed this story, you will surely love the next one. It's as crazier and more intriguing as you can ever imagine, so do check it out. Click on the image showing on your screen right now to watch the next one. Thank you for watching this story to the end.